Hello, welcome to Holistically Speaking. I'm your host, Morella DeVoe. Our mission at Holistically Speaking is to be the avenue through which the voices of holistic health reach you at the times you need it most. So more often than not, we're talking about alternative approaches to health, different ways to deal with different conditions, and today we're talking about something slightly different. We're talking about different ways to deal with death and burial and funeral options. I'm joined today by Lisa Carlson, who's the Executive Director of Funeral Ethics, and she's also on the board of Vermont Funeral Consumers Alliance. Thank you for joining me, Lisa.
Thank you for being here.
I discovered in the process of educating myself to interview you that of just how little I knew about options for funerals, for funeral service, and for actually disposing of our, loved ones' bodies. So I'm curious, before we jump into all of that, how did you get involved in this work? How did you get started with this?
When my last husband died at the age of 31, he was a first grade teacher. Our daughter was eligible for free lunch at school, and I had almost no money in the bank. And one of the writers in my writers group had brought an article on how to bury your own dead in Vermont just 6 months before.
Oh, wow.
So I had the information that I needed when I needed it, and chose to, I would have buried him at home, but the ground was frozen. We lived out in the country with a donkey and pigs and sheep.
Right.
We were married at home. We had no religious affiliation. But with a friend, we drove his body to the crematory without the use of a funeral director. And with my permission, the writer wrote about the fact that I had indeed done this. And for the next year, a week rarely went by without a phone call or letter from other people wanting to know what to do and how to do it. So I was so grateful. Sally wasn't going to do anything more with the topic, but I was so grateful, I thought I needed to share it. And if it was the same in every state, maybe it was a magazine article. If it was different in every state, maybe it was a book. So I went to the state law library and researched the laws for every state, and indeed thought it ought to be a book.
Right.
So I did an outline and sample chapters and sent it off to 26 different publishers, small, medium, and large. And as my then 5-year-old daughter said, walking back from the mailbox, "Another ejection, Mommy." And after 26 ejections, I put it aside and was unbelievably fortunate enough to remarry a year and a half later. And Steve was also a writer, and his mother died of AIDS in 1986. And again, it was a death that we handled as a family without a funeral director. And afterwards, we began to talk. It was at the time the whole small press movement was exploding, and anyone with a computer could get a book in print.
Yeah.
So it hit the New York Times as a news story, and I was on CBS this morning, Good Morning America.
Oh, wow.
The
Bigger studio than this.
the Donahue Show twice.
Wow.
So what was then Memorial Societies, now Funeral Consumers Alliance, found me, and my information, legal information, could help them when they couldn't find affordable options. They could bypass the industry entirely. And that was, when I got involved with that, I was interested in the rights of all funeral consumers, not just the do-it-yourselfers.
Right. Wow, fascinating. And so I'm interested in the title of your latest book. This is your latest book, right? The one you have right here.
Final Rights.
Final Rights. And if we can show it, we can switch cameras to have, if you want to lift it a little bit. Final Rights. And it says, Reclaiming the American Way of Death, and it's co-written by you and Joshua Slocum.
Yes.
So what struck me as immediately as I read it is, what is the American way of death that we need to reclaim?
Well, most people don't realize that they can indeed handle a death without a funeral director. Years ago, it would be the women in the community who would come in and help with the bathing and the dressing, and the men would build a casket and dig the grave.
Right.
And so that kind of participatory involvement was the early American tradition. And what many of us have discovered is that having something physical to do takes away the sense of helplessness.
Yeah.
There was a wonderful, wonderful, very touching story when I was executive director of Funeral Consumers Alliance before I sort of retired to do the funeral ethics. And I got a call from a gentleman in California whose son's daughter had died of SIDS. And he called wanting to know if it was legal for his son to build the casket. And I said, not only is it legal to build the casket, let me read you something if you're calling on my nickel. And I had written about the death of a 5-year-old. It was a very short, rather poetic piece of writing. But I wanted to share it with him so he knew that other people had done this.
Right.
And he said, oh, that's beautiful. Could you fax it to me? And I said, I'd be glad to. And he gave me a phone number, and I tried faxing, and the fax didn't go through, and it didn't go through, and it didn't go through, and I didn't even have his name. I felt terrible. The next day, the other grandfather called, and he said, I've called to give you the right fax number. He said, I have to tell you that this death has changed an entire community. That it was very important for the parents to be able to dig the grave by hand, and they drove around and found a small cemetery out in the country. And the town was very cooperative. And he said, I never thought I'd have the guts to do this, but he said, after I get off the phone with you, a group of us are going out to the cemetery to clean it up as a gift to the town. And there were a group of women coming in to help his daughter bathe and dress the body. So the whole getting involved was just very therapeutic.
Yeah, and dealing with the whole preparation of this child's body must have been, I can imagine all of us listening to this like, oh my God, that must be so difficult. But at the same time, it must bring incredible closure and healing.
One of the first feedbacks I got on my first book was from a woman in Massachusetts who said, I can't tell you how much your book has empowered me. And that just really made me high, that empowerment.
Yeah.
Letting people know what they could do, what their choices were.
So as I'm relating to some of the people maybe watching and saying, okay, what are the choices that I have that maybe I'm not aware of? And of course there are multiple, but can you start sharing with us some of those different choices?
Well, I'm the queen of cheap, and so I want to go to med school through the back door.
Right.
I'm a doctor's daughter and a doctor's sister. And in Vermont, you have to sign up ahead of time. They won't let the next of kin donate the body.
Right.
So my husband and I have both signed up, but you need to have backup plans because if you were to die on the operating table or in a car accident, then your body wouldn't be acceptable for medical study.
Oh, okay.
So you should know what your other choices are.
And that's actually something that I learned today as I was reading, getting myself ready for the interview, and I was going through all of the different incredible amount of information that you've gathered and that you present so well, and just learning that if you want your body donated to UVM for the medical school, that you need to do it in life. And I mean, you can, I guess, if you die in a hospital, you could do organ donation, but if you haven't donated your whole body for anatomy.
Only about 3% of the deaths would qualify for organ donation. You have to be brain dead, but still alive.
Oh, yeah.
For things, a few, they're experimenting with cadaver donation after death, but for the most part, like a liver or heart, that you still have to be pumping.
Right. So, so if people donate their body to UVM, to a medical school, the medical school covers the charges of...
Yes, they cremate, it's a loan, and they cremate the body and return the cremated remains after study in a year or two. And you should let people know if you were to die while traveling, you don't want the expense of shipping your body back to UVM. You might consider donating to the nearest med school. And in Europe, there's a much greater need for body donation too.
Oh, really?
So
Is there just a different attitude or a different tradition?
think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
So then there are no costs to the family if you've donated your body to UVM, except if you have a service, a memorial service or
Right.
something like that.
Now, that's not true of every med school. In Florida, the family has to pay for the embalming and transportation, which I think is outrageous.
Right.
So
Yeah. So that's one of the
That's
options.
one.
What other options do people
burial or cremation are the other two options. Alkaline hydrolysis is coming. That's a lye bath that dissolves the body.
have? Oh my gosh, I've never even heard of that.
Yeah, and I'm more interested in promession, which is freeze drying. But that's very expensive equipment, and I don't think that'll be anytime soon. But
So when you freeze dry a body, is it, what I'm imagining is some sort of mummification happening?
it just fragments the body, and can be used for composting.
Oh, so.
I mean, it's like freeze-dried coffee.
But then is it whole or does it?
No,
oh,
it just
falls apart.
all falls apart.
Oh, interesting. So it's a more kind of organic
Yep.
type of, you can use it organically. Whereas
Exactly.
when you dissolve it in something.
Feed the rose bush your own bone meal.
Oh, wow. Yeah, interesting. So now those, I'm assuming that those options would be more expensive
Yes.
rather than.
Yep. The least expensive would be burial on your own land. So if you're not right in the village or city,
Right.
in a relatively rural area, you need to be 150 feet from a water supply and 25 feet from a power line in case it goes underground in the future.
And you need to get certain permits from your
You need a
town
death
or so-
certificate, a burial transit permit. And if for home burial, I recommend drawing a map of the land and showing where the family burial ground is and pay to have it recorded with the deed. And that's likely to make it a more permanent
Right. Yeah.
easement on the land.
Right. And then cremation.
Yes. And there are about 9 crematories in Vermont, but only 2 of them will accept a body directly from a family. The one in St. Johnsbury run by a cemetery, and the one down near Brattleboro run by a private pair of gentlemen.
And why will the other ones not accept a body
They want you to pay the price of
of the funeral service?
of their picking up the body and doing the paperwork. I think they see it as competition.
Oh, interesting. So you can't just get your permit to bring your body to the crematory.
No, so when my uncle died here in Chittenden County at St. Joe's Catholic Home, I didn't have a dignified way to get his body out of the building. So I asked a friendly funeral director to pick up the body for me. But I had cardboard caskets at home for the do-it-yourselfers. And so we put Uncle Henry in the cardboard casket and then drove to St. Johnsbury. So
Okay.
that was, and I should let people know, I've got a wooden casket that I was given by a casket retailer going out of business, and I will give it away to anyone who needs it.
Oh, wonderful.
I was given 2 and gave one to a friend whose daughter was indigent, and I'd be happy to give it to someone else.
Someone who doesn't have the means at
Yeah.
all. And so that's the other piece of information that you also share in your many sources of information. I think it might be even in this little brochure, right? The state support for people without means.
Yes, $1,100 is available through the state, and the family can contribute some additional funds. But generally speaking, you could get a cremation pretty close to that price.
Yeah. Yeah, I just looking at that amount of money that the state can will provide, and then the option that you can actually take your loved one, drive them to St. Johnsbury if you get a permit, then it sounds pretty reasonable that you could actually
Yep.
take care of the service.
And there's a wonderful veterans cemetery in Randolph. It's a beautiful cemetery, and that's free to veterans and their spouses.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, I didn't know. And this brochure is called Your Funeral Consumer Rights in Vermont. Obviously, you can't see it, but it's I read it this morning, and it's a really quick, easy read with all of the different details on funeral arrangements and autopsy and organ donation and tissue donation, caskets and burials and cremation. Like all of the different options are on here. And this is on your funeralethics.org website.
If you go to the funeralethics.org website, you'll see in red, click here, and there's a funeral consumer rights pamphlet for every state.
Yes. So that was the other thing that marveled me, the amount of research that you must have had to do to gather all of this for every single state.
Well, I love doing the research, actually.
Oh, good.
And what's interesting is that when I first started 25 years ago, I had to go to the state law library and copy things on the copy machine. Now everything's on the internet, and so it's much easier.
A lot easier.
So,
but it's an incredible, and we'll have that website for you, for our viewers, at the end of the show, so you can write it down, because it is incredible that you have every single state is listed. So it's just so user-friendly to say, oh, well, I'm a Vermont resident, but my parents are in North Carolina or Minnesota or wherever they are.
Exactly. And that was why I really felt it needed to be a book, because families are so fragmented, dispersed.
Yeah, exactly. And you were telling me a story, I can't remember if it was before we started the show, but you were telling me a story about a woman who prepaid for her funeral arrangements in Florida, but then she died in New Jersey.
Right.
And it was kind of a mess.
Yes, Florida is one of the worst states in which to prepay. And that's one of the things I cover, are the pros and cons of paying for your funeral in each of the brochures. In Vermont, if you move, perhaps to be with an adult child, you're at risk of losing 5% of what you prepaid.
Yeah.
We now have a guarantee fund to cover embezzlement if the funeral director embezzles the prepaid funeral money. But in Florida, the New Jersey funeral director was told to come and get the casket. It was in the warehouse in Florida. So when you move away from Florida, you're at risk of losing 60% of what you paid.
Oh my gosh. That's incredible. So this is so valuable because also so many people go to retire in Florida. And
why in a retirement state are the laws so bad?
So bad for...
The only time it makes any sense to prepay is if you have to set aside assets for Medicaid eligibility.
Oh, interesting.
Otherwise, put money in a CD with a survivor on the account. There's no penalty for early withdrawal if it's a case of death.
Right.
So, and then you're totally in control of the money there.
Oh, that makes so much sense. So on your website, I think it's in the, not the funeral ethics, but there's one where you have, maybe it's the Vermont, where you have funeral suggestions and affordable options.
Yes.
That are so helpful. I learned a lot today, so I really recommend that you check out these websites. But one of the things that struck my eye was that in some of your funeral suggestions, you said suggested non-embalming. And so I was curious as to what the embalming process is about, and what are your thoughts about it?
It's really a very invasive procedure, and it simply isn't done in most other countries.
No.
The first part of the embalming process is relatively surgical and benign. They make an incision where there's both an artery and a vein, and they pump in the pink pickle juice and drain the blood. But the second part of the embalming process is really gruesome, and they have a long, hollow bayonet type tool with a suction hose on it, and it gets jabbed in near the navel and is used to puncture all internal organs.
Oh.
And it just it seems so.
And what's the purpose of that? I don't even.
They pump in more pickle juice to
fill all of the cavities
to
and the.
slow down the decomposition. Now, in the Netherlands, they have up to 5 days before burial or cremation is required, and they don't embalm.
Yeah.
So temperature has more to do with decomposition than the time elapsed after death. Theosophists will sit with the body for 3 days waiting for the spirit to leave.
Yeah.
So you can turn off the heat, turn on the air conditioning.
Yeah.
If it's really hot summer weather, maybe dry ice.
Right.
But you're usually fine for 2 or 3 days at 70 degrees or less.
Yeah, and that was it's always been something that's been interesting. The contrast to me. I grew up in Venezuela, like I was telling you before, and in Venezuela there isn't embalming. People just don't get embalmed, and it's the tropics, so it's not particularly cool. But burials, funeral services, the whole viewing, the funeral service, the memorial, whatever's going to happen, and then either, cremation or burial happen pretty much within 3 days. They're gone. Arrangements are done from one day to the next. Everybody shows up, and in 2 or 3 days it's done. And I have always kind of been a little surprised by how long it takes here, and maybe it's because families are away, and so you have a viewing a week after they passed, and then it's just, and so that also I'm sure gets promoted as a way to then sell an embalming process, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And if if the family is dispersed and they want to travel around work schedules, there are sometimes good reasons to delay the funeral.
Yeah, there are sometimes restrictions to that. So then if somebody is doing a home burial, is there some sort of legal timeline that they need to be within before they are in trouble because they have somebody?
Not in Vermont.
Oh, okay. So it's just more a matter of...
Good sense, common sense.
Right. I wasn't sure. It's like, do you need to do it within a timeline? So some of the other things that you mention is as a funeral suggestions that can make a difference is not doing the makeup or open casket. What's the reasoning behind that for that suggestion? Is there any costs involved, or?
If you want to, the fewer services, the less your funeral is going to cost. And I often recommend that people consider an open house at home if they don't have a religious affiliation.
Right.
Instead of having a service at the funeral home, plan a memorial service.
Right.
And one of the classiest memorials I ever went to was done by a sister for a deceased sister who was an artist. It was held at an art gallery with a string jazz quartet, and people shared wonderful stories about the deceased sister, and then we had wine and finger food afterwards, and and the invitations were so classy. It was just lovely.
Lovely, yeah. So it's so interesting. You've shared with us so many different ideas, but the whole concept that really grabs me is that the more involved people are in the whole arrangement process, and as opposed to just handing it off to someone and showing up, the more involved people are, seems to be create more of a sense of closure.
And it's very therapeutic to have, it takes away the sense of helplessness to have something to do. And the pediatric oncology nurse in California who found my first book said when she started using it with parents who had lost a child, that there was a dramatic difference in the healing when parents had a hands-on funeral experience.
Yeah, wow. So we have a couple more minutes, and I want to make sure that our viewers get a chance to write down all of your great websites. So if we can show those couple of resources pages, and of course your books. So we've got funerals.org, and can you tell us a little bit about what that website is?
That's the National Funeral Consumers Alliance.
Okay.
Joshua Slocum took over when I retired,
Yeah.
and you just find a huge amount of information, what to do while traveling, that kind of thing.
Wonderful. And then, sorry?
And if you want to find a local Funeral Consumers Alliance, there are about 100 affiliates around the country. So if you wanted to hook your parents or another family member up with a funeral consumer group, that would be the page to check it out.
Wonderful. And then there's funeralethics.org. Oh, can we go back? Thank you.
Funeral Ethics, that's where you will find the Funeral Consumer Rights pamphlet.
Oh, right, the one that's one quick page, easy reference for Vermont and for each state.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
the next one is the Health Vermont, the Vermont Department of Health.
Yeah.
Just so that you don't have to take my word for it, there's a state agency that says, yes, you can do this.
Gotcha.
And then the last one, vermontfca.org, is the Vermont Funeral Consumers Alliance. And on that, you will find our price survey from 2013.
Gotcha. And then the next slide is your two books, I Died Laughing, Funeral Education with a Light Touch. And can you tell us quickly, we've got another minute, can you tell us quickly what that book is about?
Yes, it's jokes and cartoons, and then we get to a page that says, but seriously. So I cram in some practical information before we go back to more jokes and cartoons.
About death and dying and funerals.
The mother-in-law called the daughter-in-law, said, I've decided I want to be cremated, and the daughter-in-law said, great, get your coat on, I'll be right over.
Let's do it right now.
Right.
So, and then obviously the book that we mentioned earlier is Final Right, and that's all about the consumer choices.
And if you wanted just the Vermont chapter, at funerals.org, you can order it for only $5.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
And that walks you through how to file the death certificate and everything.
Perfect. So much information that you have done an incredible job putting together. And what I loved, I didn't get this on the phone when I spoke with you, but the minute that we sat down, what I love is your lightness and sense of humor, and how important it is to just keep it light, and be involved. And I think those are the two key things that I'm taking away from you that have been really wonderful for me. It's getting really involved, finding out, what I can do, and keeping it light and laughing through it.
And it breaks the ice to use humor when people are having a hard time talking about it.
Right.
Humor makes a difference.
Humor does make a difference, even in death. Thank you so much for joining me, Lisa.
Thank you, Morella.
And thank you for joining us. I'm sure this was helpful and informative to you. We'll see you next time.